Well, good morning. Good morning. It's 10 o'clock and welcome to Bible Study Live. My name's Colin Points. I'm the pastor of Winslow Christian Fellowship, and we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 5, 21 to 43. I'm preparing to preach on that for the Sunday service. I did that last week, didn't I? Turn the volume down on that while I monitor. If you do want to leave any comments in the chat, then please feel free. I've got it here so I can see what's any comments that do come up. Okay, right. Got some zooming in today, so that's the Bible text. Hope you can read that okay. Mark chapter 5, 21 to 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him. And he... sorry, I'll just check in on something. Yeah. A great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Okay. So, what's this about? It's two stories, but they're sandwiched. So you start with one, go to the second, and then you come back to the first story. So it's a sandwich structure. You've got the little girl who is dying. Little girl is dying. Woman is bleeding, and then the little girl is dead. So, painful stuff, but Jesus cures not just the illness but the death, which is pretty extraordinary. So there's that sandwich structure, ABA. And yeah, let's just work through it one verse at a time. So, verse 21 says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea." So, this passage, it's narratively linked with the last two by. It's that connection with the sea, isn't it? That keeps one story ends up the first story of Jesus teaching, then gets in the boat, crosses the sea, and during the crossing of the sea, he calms the storm, and then you've got the business of him meeting Legion. Then he crosses the sea back to the other side, which shows that his visit to the other side, to the Gerasenes, it was just for Legion's purpose of healing the man from the demons. Didn't seem to have any other purpose for being there. The Sea of Galilee. Jesus has crossed back to the other side. He just went over to the Gerasenes. Must have miraculously known what was going to happen when he went over there. And so he's back, and that's not how you spell Galilee, is it? Oops. Okay. Crossed in the boat to the other side. A great crowd gathered about him. So you can't get rid of the crowds. I mean, I'm sure in some ways he doesn't want to, but in other ways he seems a bit reluctant to become a celebrity. Naturally, he doesn't want to be a celebrity. He wants to teach. That's the difference, I guess. Reluctant when it comes to crowds. Doesn't want to be a celebrity. He wants to teach. Just as he doesn't want to perform miracles just for the sake of performing miracles, he wants that to have a beneficial teaching purpose, the miracles. He wants them to have a reason. So, just in case you've just joined me, this is I know there's only three, it says here, 3 people watching, which yeah, that's fine. I'm not bothered about how many people watch live. If you watch live, then that's great. You can use the chat, and I'll keep an eye on any messages. And if you ask questions or if you suggest things that I've missed, then that's great. Go ahead, use the chat. And if you're watching later on, then great. I think there were something like 25, 26 views when I last looked at last week's video. So I hope this is helpful. This is hopefully demystifying what I do, because I think some people think there's some kind of magical power when I preach, that somehow it just comes to me what I'm going to say. But what I do is I work at it and I think about it and I ask questions of the passage, and that's what you're hopefully going to get to see, and it hopefully would empower you and give you the confidence to just do the same thing and see, well, you know, it's not some great shakes, it's nothing too special, it's just looking at the story, looking at the words, thinking about what they mean. He doesn't want to be a celebrity, he wants to teach us so this great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. So he's still beside the sea. Is that a significant thing? Is it just locating us in the story? Mark gives us these pointers where we can fix what's going on, and it means that certain stories are connected. This is all happening, one thing after the other. He was on this side of the Sea of Galilee, went across, hit by a storm, calmed it, met this man, cured him from his demons, came back across. Now he's going to meet this new thing. So, verse 22. Shall we come on to verse 22? Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. Seeing him, he fell at his feet. That's interesting. Now, I wonder if that's deliberate, whether that mirrors the actions of Legion, falling at his feet. I don't know if it does. It's just one of those things that people do when they come to Jesus and recognise his authority. That's what we're dealing with, isn't it? It's authority. Authority over nature, and we've done it was the calming of the storm. Authority over evil was the casting out of the demons, and now authority over sickness and death. So Jairus, ruler of the synagogue. So, a man of status. Just go have a quick look at this commentary. Can you read that? I think you can just about read that. Jesus was probably busy teaching when he was interrupted by the plea of one of the synagogue rulers. This does not mean that Jairus was one of several rulers in a particular synagogue, though synagogues did have more than one, but that he belonged to that particular group called synagogue rulers. So he was this particular synagogue's ruler. Okay, these were laymen whose responsibilities were administrative, not priestly, and included such things as looking after the building and supervising the worship. So he was the building's manager, he was the administrator. Sometimes the title was honorary, given to prominent members of the congregation with no administrative duties attached. He was a deacon. And like some churches, deacons have got that position because they've always been deacons and they don't necessarily do anything anymore. I don't think that's the case here at WCF though. At Antioch, Paul and Barnabas were invited by the synagogue rulers to participate in the service. Jairus' need so urgent that he jettisoned all dignitary and pride, fell at Jesus' feet and begged for help. So Jairus is the guy that organises the synagogue, a man of status, an administrator. He did the rotas, that means, I guess. Let's copy that bit there and put it in my notes. Title was honorary, given to prominent members of the... So it could be... it could be that he didn't even do the administrating, that it was just an honorary title, in which case he really is a man of status. So he has status to lose. And is presumably taking a risk by coming to Jesus, who has already started to make enemies among the religious, call them leadership, call them religious elite. That's where he makes his enemies. So you have to be careful if you're in a position of authority and status. You don't want to get too close to Jesus, I don't think. But Jairus, I can't spell, is willing to prostrate himself before Jesus, which would have been potentially humiliating. 23. So he's come and fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." We see why he's so willing to he's desperate. So we'll risk humiliation and the loss of status if it might help his daughter. Of course. He's obviously heard of Jesus. because he's asking him to come and lay hands on her so that she will be healed. Jesus can do. This is the connection. Jesus can do what the doctors can't, and we see that in the next story, don't we? That's particularly brought out. Jesus. He believes Jesus can do what the doctors cannot. Can't lay your hands so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. So the reputation Jesus is spreading and convincing even people like this I suppose this is a story of someone who would perhaps not have come to Jesus if it weren't for desperation. So yeah, sometimes God brings us to desperation in order to bring us to Him. And then verse 24, and he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So that's verse 24. Jesus decided to go with Jairus. Which is natural. Of course. Why wouldn't he go with Jairus? The man's a father, his daughter is... He's a father whose daughter is sick. Do we know she's deadly sick at this point? My daughter is at the point of death. Yeah, verse 23. Sick. At the point of death. Who could refuse? Jesus is a compassionate man. Of course, he went with him. Jesus is going out of compassion that there's a great crowd around him. Thronged, it's a word and a half, isn't it? Thronged. Synthlibon. Press together, press upon. Thronged. Throng. ESV. What other words are used? So that's the ESV that I'm looking at the moment. So if we come over to the NIV, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. That's more understandable, and that's what we'll be using on Sunday. So there's the Greek. What's that? Sunethlibon. Sunethlibon. ASV. Thronged. Sunethlibon. Yeah, go back to the ESV. So pressing up against him. Yeah, I know the ESV is can claim to be a more accurate translation than the NIV, but it's also antiquated, isn't it? At times, thronged. It's not a helpful word in modern Britain. Sounds too much like thong. So he's got these people pressing against him. Are they compassionate towards this father who may lose his daughter? Or are they simply hoping for a miracle? Okay, so that's the first bit, the sick daughter who made eye, and then we've come to the woman who's bleeding. I know this is interesting because it's verse 25. It says that there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and then later on it tells us that the little girl is 12 years old. So don't know really what the significance of that is, but it just seems like one of these things that Mark does to say these stories belong together, I think. 12 years and 12 years. So there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. No, I know what I need is Young's literal is good. And we come to verse 25. In fact, verse 24 from here down to there. And there was following him a great multitude, and they were thronging him, and a certain woman having an issue of blood 12 years, and many things having suffered under many physicians, and having spent all that she had, and having profited nothing, but rather having come to the worse, having heard about Jesus, having come to in the multitude behind, she touched his garment, for she said, if even his garments I may touch, I shall be saved. And immediately was the fountain of her blood dried up, and she knew in the body that she hath been healed of the plague. Full stop. Yeah. Read that before, studied that before, and seen that there's that one long sentence all about that woman's plight. It really does bring home the something of the let's copy the text, something of a desperation. Now, shifting across to the word processor. Where's my mouse gone? Pasted in. So let's do this. Not that you really need to see me, do you? Mess around with the text. Put the ands and the ands and havings. These are participles, I think, in the original Greek. She touched. And there was following him a great multitude, and they were thronging him, and a certain woman having an issue of blood 12 years, and many things having suffered under many physicians, and having spent all that she had, and having profited nothing, but rather having come to the worse, having heard about Jesus, having come in the multitude behind, she touched his garment, for she said, if even his garments I may touch, I shall be saved. And immediately was the fountain of her blood dried up, and she knew in the body that she had been healed of the plague. A woman, she touched his garment. That's the key sentence. A woman, I hope you can hear this, are you coming through loud and clear? The microphone's over there, so I'm a bit quieter. Should move it down really, shouldn't I? Hang on. So I'm messing about with this text, and there's this sentence, and a certain woman touched his garment. Basically, that's what it's saying. A woman touched his garment. And in between, you've got these qualifiers, if you like, this history of what's gone on, having an issue of blood 12 years, and many things having suffered under many physicians, and having spent all that she had, and having profited nothing, but rather having come to the worst. All these havings, having heard about Jesus, having come in the multitude behind. That's all these qualifying things, they're participles. Touched is the verb in this sentence. Woman is the noun, the subject, and then garment is the object. Subject, verb, subject, verb and object, and then participles of havings. Having. And a certain woman, having an issue of blood, and having suffered under many visits, and having spent all the year, having profited from it, or rather having come to the, having heard about it, having come to the knowledge, she touched his garment. For she said, and you've got the prologue and you've got the epilogue as well. Prologue being, and there was following him a great multitude, and they were thronging him. And the epilogue is, for she said, if even his garments I may touch, I shall be saved. And immediately was the explanation. And immediately was the fountain of her blood dried up, and she knew in the body that she hath been healed of the plague. That's good, that. I'm going to save that into my folder. Mark Winslow series. Mark 5 verses 24 to 29. It's not quite a sentence diagram, but I'll call it that. Okay, what are we up to? We're on to verse 25, aren't we? Verse 25, and a certain woman having an issue of blood 12 years. Amidst this crowd, Mark tells us about one person who matters. She has been bleeding for 12 years. Right, so what kind of bleeding are we talking about? I know it's often assumed that it's a period bleeding, but an issue of blood. Does that mean it is? Or is that just an assumption that commentators make and that preachers go on? And I know it's got that thing in the Old Testament that there are rules about how periods make women unclean, and that would make this a really poignant form of suffering because she can't go near anybody for 12 years. She's like the status of a leper. It's horrendous. Healing of a woman with a hemorrhage is what the commentary here talks about. The story of the healing of the woman with hemorrhages, sandwiched between the report of Jairus' daughter illness and Jesus' action in raising her life. The precise nature of the woman's ailment is not status Probably some sort of uterine disease caused the bleeding that had persisted for 12 years. Luke says of her condition that no one could heal her. Mark includes vivid details. She had suffered much, had been treated by many doctors, had spent all she had, and instead of getting better, her condition had gotten worse. Luke understandably tones down this verse. Why understandably? And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. So that was all Luke said. Let's come to this commentary and see if there's any more details about this woman's hemorrhage. The woman who unobtrusively touched Jesus had experienced a flow of blood for a period of 12 years. It's common to think of chronic hemorrhaging of the womb, but from Mark's description it is not possible to know the cause of her loss of blood. So I think that's the honest commentary. It's not commentaries obviously that give us the idea that it's period bleeding. It's just preachers picking up on the Old Testament connection. So would she be subject to the Old Testament rules about women having to isolate during their period? Where do we read about that? It's in Leviticus somewhere. One of the other commentaries. Ritual uncleanness. Here we go. Let's open that up. So we've clicked on that, gone to Leviticus 15 verse 25. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period. Oh, okay, yeah, so it doesn't specify it has to be actually her period. Or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Oh, man. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during a monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean as during her period. Whoever touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day she must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, and etc. Verse 31, you must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place which is among them. Okay, so Leviticus 15, 25, 27. So 27. There you go. Even if it's not like a period, it seems that she would need to remain isolated. "12 years, 12, exclamation mark, 12 years of separation from society." So yeah, that's pretty harsh. And of course you've got the trickiness of saying, well, that's God that made that rule. That's the Old Testament law. What must their life have been like? Self-isolation for a few months with contact with others is hard enough. The thought of going 12 years in which others would avoid you when they don't have to isolate themselves. At least we're all in it together at the moment. Let's put that in. We're all This is what I do, I just ask questions. What must life have been like? It doesn't take a lot of imagination really. And of course it connects with what we're going through now. You can relate it to that and say, well, it's even worse, isn't it? At least we're all in it together at the moment. Okay, there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. On top of that, on top of the social isolation and religious status of being impure, she also had a medical condition. Which must have left her at least weakened and possibly in constant pain. So it's a bit of a living death really, isn't it? To make another connection with a 12-year-old girl. A discharge of blood for 12 years is like being a person but not a person. You're not part of society, you're suffering and you're ignored and you're avoided. Like being a non-person. Having to suffer in isolation. Would anyone have had compassion on this woman? Could argue the doctors did, but it says she spent her money on them, so they were just doing their job. That's next verse. Verse 26. And who had suffered under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, that rather grew worse. So doctors could not help her. They not have been motivated. They would not have been motivated by compassion, though they might have felt compassion. Because it says she spent all her money. So the doctors are paid to do a job. It's no NHS. She spent all she had. She had many physicians. She had tried many. Second and third opinions didn't change anything. She presumably found the best doctor she could afford and got nowhere. In fact, she actually grew worse. So she spent all her money to improve things, and she grew worse. And that's all her money gone. And that's all her money has bought her. Okay. Verse 27. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Again, Jesus' reputation has brought her at this point in her life when she's desperate. She's coming to Jesus even though he's surrounded by this crowd who are pressing close to him. She knows that she is considered unclean, so shouldn't go near people, and certainly shouldn't touch anyone. But in her desperation, she has broken herself. Isolation. She's broken lockdown rules. Broken her self-isolation. Behind him in the crowd. I don't think that... Could she have avoided touching people? She obviously didn't avoid touching Jesus himself, because that was part of the deal. Touching his cloak, touching his garment. Maybe she was able to avoid touching others, though it's doubtful. But she certainly touched Jesus's cloak. Which would have made Jesus unclean. But here's her logic. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. She she used the logic, touching his clothes would make her well. Why would she think that? Surely Jesus's reputation as a healer has Jesus' reputation as a healer included just have to touch his clothes, even if he doesn't know you? Let's phrase it as a question. Has Jesus' reputation as a healer gone as far as to suggest that you just need contact with his clothes to be made well? That doesn't sound like Jesus. Surely his healing so far has been an intentional act on his part. So she has probably come up to him on the basis of a misunderstanding of Jesus. She thinks of him almost like a magic being. Or a lucky charm. Which Jesus is not. And yet we don't need to understand Jesus perfectly to benefit from his grace. And goodness and power. That's important, actually. I don't think I've really seen that before, that she thinks of him like a lucky charm. Just touch him and I'll be well. But that's not Jesus. He's not a lucky charm. Well, like last week, it's an hour. It's been an hour and I've barely started scratching the surface. But, you know, I'm going to finish the live stream now. I'll carry on studying this. Let me know what you think, if you think this is worth carrying on with. In some ways I might as well carry on with it, even if you don't think it's worth it. I've not got anything to lose. I'm going to be studying the Bible every week to prepare for a sermon, and why not? Why not turn on the camera and you can see what I'm doing? And if it's helpful, then great. If it's not, then no. And maybe over time there'll be more people logging on and leaving comments in the chat and doing the thinking for me, or indeed asking questions in order to stimulate my thinking beyond what I've already, my limitations, that I think along the lines of my presuppositions. And if you ask me questions, maybe I'll think about different things. Anyway, take care,